But this morning at Minyan, a friend, a colleague, happens to be a physician, approached me after davening and said he was informed of a situation in a family where there was abuse, and he reported it, and the family refused to deal with it. Child Protective Services was involved, and they did an investigation, but they couldn't go forward because the family stonewalled them. We really have to do some serious education here.
And it wasn't just me. My mom, he often babysat. My mom would send me along when he would babysit. He often abused the children he babysat for. He became a big brother in the Big Brother, Big Sister organization. He abused the child that he was a big brother to. Wow. He would babysit for cousins of ours. He abused those. And I was often there when that abuse went on as well.
Wow.
So,
can't even imagine.
And they groom you for it, he really played on each child's empathy for him. Or there were children who he turned it into a game, and he made it playful, and he made it a game. And it became this slowly growing game that got more and more intense. But there were other children that he did, like with me, where he played on their empathy.
This is what not to do. So from this angle, we can talk about what yes to do. That respecting your children's experiences and giving them a sense that whatever it is that they feel has validity, taking your time to listen to them, taking their experiences seriously, even if it's bothersome or confusing to you, but at least pausing and saying, wait, why is it that you want it this way? Okay, do you prefer it this way? You already want me to close the door? And saying that however it is that you feel regarding your body, regarding your belongings, regarding your space, I am taking that into account. I am valuing what you have to say because your experience has value.
Welcome back to the Jews Next Door podcast, where each month we explore a different topic of our parenting hierarchy with the goal of raising the next generation of passionate and committed Jews. I'm your host, Rabbi Yair Menshel, and we are continuing our special series for Child Safety Month. Last episode, we discussed how parents can create a relationship where children will really be willing to share. And there was 5 segments. There was a lot there. If you didn't listen to it yet, I'd strongly recommend checking it out. And this is all as a way of preventing child abuse. And in this episode, we are discussing what we can do to set up a safe home. There will be 3 segments, and we're starting with Dr. Michael Salomon, who has spoken, written, and lectured for many years at conferences and shuls, explaining how abusers groom their victims, how to recognize behavioral changes indicating that maybe a child may have been abused, and so many different things that we can do to really treat sexual abuse of children within the Jewish community. He's the author of Abuse in the Jewish Community and is recognized as a presidential citation for his transformative work in raising awareness on the prevention of the treatment of child sexual abuse in the Orthodox Jewish community by the APA. And he is also on clinical staff at North Shore Hospital. And a really tremendous thank you to Dr. Salomon. Thank you so much for your time and really for your devotion to the safety of our children.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Also, thank you just in general for taking the time to, and devoting your time to the safety of our children. It's incredible, really.
Somebody has to.
It's true. It's true. But, it's not an easy job. And, we appreciate you taking the time on it.
Thanks.
I'm curious, at the risk of sounding naive and being, be a poster child for someone who has the classic signs of cognitive dissonance, is abuse within the family so prevalent?
Much more than most people realize. We have to go back a few years. The push years ago was to teach children about what was then called stranger danger. Watch out for the people who might not know, but who might try and steal you away and abuse you. We have found out through much research over the years that stranger danger is very unlikely to happen. It does happen, but maybe 10% of the time, maybe even less. The thing about it is we don't have such great statistics just yet in the frum world. We have statistics in the world at large, and from that perspective, there have been a variety of studies and meta-analyses, which is a combination of studies, which suggest that about 1/3 of all child sexual abuse cases are perpetrated by immediate family members. So given that information, a few years ago, we started to look at some of the data within the practice that I'm involved in, a few psychologists and social workers, and we keep some statistics. And within our group, we were looking at patterns of who was abused and how they were abused and who abused them. And we found that family members were way up there in terms of the types of abusers. That led to a couple of studies that one is in publication with the journal Trauma Psychology, and another one is just about to be published within the same journal. And what we found was in the first study, which was more a study of Jewish Orthodox singles, was that about 14%, I think it was 13.5%, reported that they were sexually abused.
Wow.
Which is a little bit lower than we had anticipated based on some other studies. These types of people, teachers, rebbeim, counselors, it's because some of these, or many of these, we're not exactly sure. Again, it's a hypothesis. Many of these were individuals who had been in dormitories. And that's where, at least clinically from some of the experiences that we have anecdotally, that's where these individuals were abused, or more likely to have been abused than at home. And it's also interesting that mothers were listed as abusers about 2% of the time, grandfathers about 6% of the time, cousins about 6% of the time. And there's a category entitled Other, which we just couldn't break down because we didn't get enough responses to indicate what that was. That was about 11% of the time, somebody not listed, or we weren't given that information. So, yeah, your cognitive dissonance is how I felt initially when I started as a fellow doing my fellowship, and I was assigned a case of a young frum girl who had been abused by a bus driver. And I just couldn't believe it because it just didn't make any sense. And the way I really got into it was, my father, I always discussed some of the things I was doing. And he said to me, you wrote about other things. You wrote a book about the Shidduch crisis, and you're doing all kinds of studies on Holocaust survivors. Maybe you need to do a study about this and survivors of this kind of abuse. And so he was one who actually motivated me to get really involved. That's how it all started.
Wow. I mean, I'm really blown away by these numbers. I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around the numbers. Is that a normal reaction that you get when discussing this stuff, or this is now this is more commonplace?
It's interesting. If you speak to people who are in the field, they actually understand these numbers. And of course, they're seeing it, especially those who are trained to deal with this kind of sexual abuse trauma. But if you speak to the general population, they just have a hard time believing it. In fact, there are many cases where people know that somebody's an abuser and they just don't want to report it. They feel that it's just not real. They're busy protecting the abusers rather than understanding that it's a serious problem that needs to be addressed.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's a tough question because how can we explain to children, or really anyone, but specifically our children in this case that we're talking about parenting, that the people who we love and who are in our family can really be potentially harming, and we can't be keeping their secret, and it's not helpful to ourselves, and it's not helpful to them, it's not helpful to anyone, and also while balancing the fact that we want our children to be able to have meaningful relationships with our family members.
Maybe I shared, but this morning at Minyan, a friend, a colleague, happens to be a physician, approached me after davening and said he was informed of a situation in a family where there was abuse, and he reported it, and the family refused to deal with it. Child Protective Services was involved, and they did an investigation, but they couldn't go forward because the family stonewalled them. We really have to do some serious education here. In addition, the Rabbinical Council of America just recently released a set of guidelines for shuls on how to deal with this. I'm happy to say that I was one of the people involved in drafting those guidelines. A couple of important people, Rabbi Yosef Blau was involved, or Mark Pratch, and a couple of colleagues and friends were involved, and hopefully it will be properly spread to the shuls. And that alone would be a nice educational piece if the Rabbeim in the shuls instituted these programs and educated their constituents, their congregants to learn about these issues.
Right. So what type of message do we explain to our children about how they can have that balance? Meaning we want them to have a relationship. At the same time, we want them to realize that not everyone is safe. Not everyone, people can be harmful.
Okay. It starts young. We have to teach our children that their bodies are their own and that no one is allowed to touch their bodies unless they're comfortable with it and who they can be comfortable with. So that would include a doctor, but only if a parent is there. That would include individuals who, we get into this all the time. There are children who like to be hugged by family members and children who don't. And that's something that children have to be given the ability to say that they want it or they don't want it, and they have to be respected. That goes well beyond whether or not it's halachically appropriate. This is an issue of how an individual child feels about themselves. And we have to teach them that it's okay to be able to say those are restrictions. Those are the limitations that they are entitled to.
So how should a parent respond? Let's say if a child is saying to them, Bubby or Safta or grandma or grandpa is giving me these mushy kisses and hugs, and I really don't like it. I don't feel comfortable.
Then we have to say, okay, I'm going to speak to them. I will speak to Safta. I'll speak to Zaidi. I'll speak to whomever to make sure that they don't give you mushy kisses. Tell me what you feel comfortable with, and let's discuss it. And we will set limits so that you're comfortable with whatever is going on. Mm-hmm. By the way, again, grandparents are in this list of abusers. So we have to respect the child's feelings. And in addition to that, I really want to make a point that roughly 95% of the time, if a child says that they've been abused, the odds are they've been abused. Parents need to respect that and understand it, and not make their child feel uncomfortable if they tell them that this is going on, but validate the child and encourage them to tell what is happening so that we can protect the child.
So, you were saying before that oftentimes it's mostly, like an older brother when we're dealing with a female. So what should a parent tell a 14-year-old daughter in terms of, her safety and her body, and let's say when an older brother or a younger brother, but typically more likely, I assume an older brother is home, and maybe let's say he's bringing a friend over, like what should the parents advise in that situation?
So I wouldn't wait till age 14. I'd start around age 8. And by the way, just as an aside, and this is not a criticism, this is just a research observation, the larger the family, the harder it is to police this. So it's important that parents understand that they have this obligation to police. They have an obligation to teach. The obligation to police means if you have any concern about any of your children being with someone else, then you need to be there. I mean, you used to say things like, if you have a computer, it needs to be in a public place. Well, if your 8-year-old daughter or 6-year-old daughter or 14-year-old daughter is hanging around with her 12 or 18-year-old brother and his friends, then there needs to be an adult there to supervise. And may not be an appropriate issue to separate them. They may be having a good time playing board games or something, but there needs to be an adult who's there to supervise. And if you can't do that, then if you can't supervise, then you can't allow them to be together. And you have to make that clear to all of them, not just to the young girl, but to the older brother.
Sure. Yeah. Right. And, and you were saying like being aware of what's going on. So that's actually one of the themes that we're addressing in this series, is specifically situational awareness, meaning parents have to take a look at the different resources that risk safety of their children, and setting up systems and supervision, like you're saying, to mitigate those risks. So if let's say I invited you to my home, right now, or you walked into any random Jewish person's home, what are some of the risks that you might identify as walking in?
Just like if you're running a school or you have a shul, there should be windows in all the doors. If there's a basement and all the toys are in the basement and all the kids are congregating in the basement, that's the same thing as having a door that has no windows. You need to allow the children to have their places to play, but there's got to be a way to keep an eye on that. Similarly, people ask if they should give their children the right to lock their doors. That might be a safety issue that goes beyond abuse. Might be a fire hazard, might not. I don't know. That would depend. But you can absolutely say that you're not allowed into your sibling's room after a certain time, and the child who lives in that room has the right to say, "I don't want anybody in my room," and that has to be enforceable as well. So it's a matter of where children congregate. It's a matter of how the room is set up, and it's a matter of the regulations on how the room possessiveness is enforced.
You mentioned the playroom concept. So does that mean that, let's say, a parent shouldn't allow a child to have a play date, let's say, or, let's say they have a couple of children and to have play dates all playing together, let's say downstairs in the basement while they're upstairs, let's say during the Shabbos meal, right? So everyone wants to go downstairs and play. Does that mean that one parent has to go downstairs to go and, be downstairs or not necessarily?
Maybe I'm a little neurotic. I don't think you have to be down there constantly, but I think maybe Yotzei V'Nechnas, and once in a while you go down, you go out, you go out and go out, and you do it randomly, and different people, different parents, different adults do it. That's the way we've always done it in our family. We do have a basement with a lot of toys, and in Kanahara we had children and grandchildren and neighbors come by, and we can have 20, 30 kids at a time at one point, but always supervised. Sometimes it would be constant depending on who was there, and sometimes it wouldn't be.
Sure. And what about, let's say children, sons and daughters sharing a bathroom? Is that something that is okay? Is it not okay? What types of provisions should we be putting into place to make sure that it's done okay, or is it not okay at all? What do you recommend in terms of that?
Well, if you're a family with Kanahara 7 or 8 children, and there are only 2 bathrooms in the house, you're going to be sharing bathrooms. Again, it's a matter of setting limits. It's a matter of who's allowed in when, and it's a matter of making sure that the door gets locked if you need the privacy at that point. And it's a matter of allowing the enforceability of it to be clear to everybody. And if anybody in the family cannot keep to that, then they need to be disciplined appropriately.
Right. Would you go as far as saying, let's just say someone is hypothetically building a brand new house, okay, and they're in the middle of listening to this episode. Should they make sure while building this house, is the ideal thing, let's say, to set up the house in a way that you have a separate entrance for guests, for just as an example, or is that that's going far and not necessary per se?
I'm pretty sure that that's not necessary. In fact, separate entrances might make it more difficult to police who's coming and going. Every house has 1 or 2 entrances that are addition to the main one, but if you specify that only your older brother can come in through the back door, then who's monitoring the front door and the back door? And it gets a little more complex.
Sure.
You want to know who's coming in. You want to know when they're coming and when they're leaving. You want to be able to set limits on that. It's probably a better idea not to add too many entrances and exits.
Right. Anything else that I'm missing in terms of this concept of, situational awareness and making sure to set up the right types of rules to set up a healthy home?
I think the biggest issue that I always see is the fact that parents just don't always believe what their children are telling them. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it's because they don't want to believe it, because they feel guilty that it happened under their watch. And sometimes it's because they just don't want to believe something like this can happen. Either way, I think it's a parent's responsibility to be on top of things and to monitor. And like I said, if you can't be there constantly, play should be in an open setting as much as possible. Those are the main issues here. And if there is a problem within the family, it's important to deal with it immediately, not wait, not think you can handle it on your own, because unless you're trained to handle it, you're going to mess up and it's going to get worse.
Right.
That's inevitable.
It's interesting. You mentioned like that parents don't always believe. So in this next segment of this episode, I speak to a survivor of of their brother, sexually abusing them for many years. And like you're saying, the parents just didn't even believe. And even post facto, even years later, it was still hard for them to fully believe and wrap their head around it. And, obviously all the listeners will get the full story in the next segment, but it's interesting as you're mentioning that.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I see it far too often.
Yeah. Any final message on this topic of, creating the safe home, situational awareness, any final message?
Again, anything can happen anywhere. And sometimes you can't always control for it. But if you put some basic stops in place, the likelihood of there being a problem is minimized. So it's important for a parent to be vigilant. It's important to be on top of things. It's important to set limits. It's important to validate the child's feelings about who they're physically close with and who they want to be hugged by, and whether or not they care if they're getting mushy kisses. And you can't tell a child you have to kiss your savta if the child just can't feel comfortable doing it. And then again, based on the fact that we have some data now that a lot of this situational stuff is within the family, and abuse can come from a brother or a father more than in other situations, particularly for females, then we need to make sure that those types of individuals are behaving appropriately and monitored appropriately. The other part of this is, if our hypothesis about the male survivors being abused more in dormitories than in their homes, then we need to put guidelines in place for these. That they're not, if they're going into ninth grade, they're 13 or 14 years old and they're going away for the first time. They need to learn how to protect themselves, and that's basically a parent's responsibility. They need to be spoken to about what's appropriate and how to handle it. And if something is not right, they need to notify their parents immediately, and we have to validate what they're saying. Those are the kinds of things that have to be addressed, and the more we address them, the better it is.
Wow. Very, very true. Thank you so much. This is very informative and really practical. You gave such really great practical suggestions, and really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity. I appreciate that.
And thank you all for all your work in preventing this. It's like you said, someone's got to do it, and appreciate that you've taken the time.
Yep. Thank you.
In this next segment of this episode on setting up a healthy home, we have the opportunity to speak to Kim Siegel, who's an educator for the past 38 years, currently the science and humanities teacher at WTA, where I have the pleasure of working and seeing Kim's amazing connection with students, and just incredible teacher and educator that she is. And Kim herself is someone who is a survivor of child abuse. And really, thank you so much for taking the time, and not just taking the time, but being willing to share with us about this time in your life. So I guess first, let's just start off, just tell us a little bit about yourself.
First of all, I am a mother, first and foremost. I have 4 beautiful children that I gave birth to, and I've fostered about somewhere between 15 and 20 other children over the years. I love children. I believe very strongly in protecting them and giving them a safe and loving environment.
Wow.
And I try and be cognizant of all my interactions with children and the effect it has long-term on them.
Totally. I'm sure that has what to do with what we'll talk about. So, I understand very little. I know very little about your story. I understand that you're a survivor of child, sexual abuse. Can you, tell us a little bit more? How old were you when this happened? What happened? Who did it happen with? Just, give us a little bit of a sense.
I generally say the abuse happened from ages 3 to 12. My earliest memories are from age 3. I don't really have any memories from before that. And can I really be 100% sure that I was 3? No, but I do know by the time I entered school. So if I went to preschool at age 4, It was definitely occurring by then. It was an older brother of mine. I am the youngest of four. He was not the oldest. He was a middle child, but he was about 5.5 years older than me.
Wow. And what was your relationship like with this brother?
Well, that particular brother was a very socially awkward person. He seemed forlorn. He seemed, kind of a sad puppy in many ways. And he played upon the empathy that I felt for him. It almost felt like he wasn't quite as loved by my parents as any of the other children. And he lived up to their expectation on so many levels,
Self-fulfilling prophecy.
Like a self-fulfilling prophecy on so many levels. Yes. Wow.
And, you said it was until age 12. So how did you stop it at age 12?
So it's an interesting story. When I was 12, first of all, I ran away from home 5 times that year.
When you were 12, you're saying?
When I was 12, I slept in a telephone booth. If you know what telephone booths are, if you're old enough to know what they are. But I slept in a telephone booth through a snowstorm.
Wow.
About 3 a.m, I called home because I was freezing. I had the police stop me one time, and because my parents had called the police when I ran away. And then when I was 12, my home burned down, and we were temporarily displaced for about 6 months. So during the time that we were displaced, the abuse had stopped. So when we moved back into our home and he went to abuse me again, I was like, oh no, this is not happening anymore, ever again. So that was what happened. He reacted very volatilely to it. Volatilely, is that a word? He threw me on the ground. He kicked me repeatedly in the stomach and the ribs and called me a selfish bee word repeatedly over and over and over again, which was interesting. My older sister was actually sitting on the front step. We were, in our household, often latchkey children, so we were home alone. We did have a babysitter, but she also just was didn't care enough to be involved in what was going on. When I was very young, even my grandmother lived in the house and yet didn't seem to be aware of what was going on. So there was a lot of neglect in general. We weren't bathed regularly. Our teeth aren't brushed. My mom was quite obese and found moving around and getting around difficult. She did hold a job and work. So she would leave every day, but she didn't have a lot of energy. And so in many ways, we were really quite neglected as children.
Wow. Did you have a close relationship with your parents?
My parents were both very demonstrative and loving. They were supportive. I was also an extremely learning disabled child. I didn't learn to read or write to the 8th grade. I learned to read or write, which is very interesting, as soon as the abuse ended.
Wow.
The abuse ended, and suddenly I was available for learning. So I was really on a first grade reading level in 8th grade. When I started 8th grade, I was still on a first grade reading and writing level. And
now you're this incredible educator. That's crazy. Wow.
And it's interesting because schools were very different in the 60s, and they came to me and they said, we can't just keep passing you along. You're on a first grade reading level. You have to learn to read this year. Not that they did anything to teach me how to read, but I did start to read. And by the end of that year, I was on a 3rd grade reading level. And by the end of 9th grade, I was on a 6th grade reading level. Wow. So I caught up 6 grades in those 2 years once the abuse stopped.
Was your relationship with your parents?
So my parents were supportive, even though I was this kid who, in many ways, teachers couldn't stand. I really didn't have a safe place because teachers couldn't stand me. If my parents were home was safe. But otherwise, of course, home was not safe. Teachers looked at me. I was this child who wasn't clean, who couldn't read or write. They were frustrated by me. They were angry at me. They were often in the 60s quite abusive. They were legally allowed to be in the 60s to, still really be quite abusive. Sometimes they would put me outside in the cold. because I wasn't reading. So school was not a safe place. Home was generally not a safe place. But my parents, when they were there, as I said, they were very loving and very demonstrative. And they would meet with the teachers and really lace into teachers over the way I was treated. And I had a teacher who, in front of me, told my parents I was retarded and that if I even was able to care for children and not damage them, that would be a lot to expect. And my mother looked down at me, held my hand and said, "You don't know what you're talking about. I have 4 bright children and this one's the brightest." So there was that support that was always there.
Wow,
and as
incredible.
I said, they were very demonstrative, always held us, hugged us, kissed us, told us how much we meant to them and they loved us. But yet didn't really know how to care for us in many ways. And there was this concept in our house, in many households, of looking okay for the neighbors, sweeping everything under the rug.
Sure.
We're this loving, wonderful family, and whatever it is in terms of, the bathing or whatever, it wasn't, in general, everything was swept under the rug and kept nice. No one should know. And so that concept was kind of pervasive in my life. As an adult, at some point, my sister, unfortunately, was involved in a very abusive marriage. And at some point, I made a decision, my husband and I made a decision, no, we're not going to allow him in our home. No, he's abused his wife. He's abused his children. If our children see us sweeping it under the rug and making nice,
and you're just
what message is that giving? So we made a decision to not allow him in our home, which was a rift because my sister was still married to him at the time. And my mother's reaction was absolute fury with us instead of with the abuser.
Interesting.
So that, we were making a rift in the family and how dare we make this decision? And
did you ever, when you got older, like have a conversation with your mother to try to understand what her thought process was, what her thinking was? I
had a couple of very, very intense conversations with her as an adult. That brother, that one who abused me, married a non-Jewish woman, then first converted to Catholicism. Then together they became born-again Christians. I guess he thinks he's, forgiven because he accepted Jesus. So therefore he's forgiven for everything. I have no idea really what he thinks, but he did cut off our family. But my mom would still often talk about him and, I guess what she felt at this child of hers, cutting her off. And so I had a very angry conversation with her. I had taken a 6-week leave of absence from work, from teaching, to care for her because she was ill. And she spent a good portion of it talking about him, what he would do when he was younger, just a lot, and until I finally blew up.
I'm sure that was probably killing you to hear it.
I said, here I am, 6 weeks leave of absence to care for you. And you're talking about him, the one who abused me. She said, I love all 4 of my children and I can't cut him off any more than I can cut off one of my own fingers. That was her reaction to me.
Wow.
So to her, she needed to not know about it, not hear about it. At some point, I was really explicit in what he did to me and what was going on. And it was pretty horrific. And still she tried to sweep it under the rug. She said it was like playing doctor, like children play doctor.
Oh, wow.
She just, to her, she couldn't accept that he had done this.
Right. Wow. Wow.
But, and it wasn't just me. My mom, he often babysat. My mom would send me along when he would babysit. He often abused the children he babysat for. He became a big brother in the big brother, big sister organization. He abused the child that he was a big brother to. Wow. He would babysit for cousins of ours. He abused those. And I was often there when that abuse went on as well.
Wow.
So,
can't even imagine.
And they groom you for it, he really played on each child's empathy for him. Or there were children who he turned it into a game. and he made it playful, and he made it a game, and it became this slowly growing game that got more and more intense. But there were other children that he did, like with me, where he played on their empathy.
Wow. Would you say that there was an aspect of your family where the boundaries maybe weren't so clear, and that's what, that allowed this to happen?
Absolutely. Absolutely. The boundaries were not clear. First of all, my grandmother lived with us, and I don't know how it seemed to me like she turned a blind eye to it, because she literally lived in the bedroom. I had a bedroom. It was 3 bedrooms and like in a triangle. It was my sister and I shared a bedroom. That brother had a bedroom, and my grandmother had the 3rd bedroom on that level. And I can't imagine she didn't know what was going on. I can't imagine it. My uncle, her son, once did something very inappropriate with a woman in front of the kids. And then my mother immediately went, got our kids out of the room. But my mother remained in the room while he acted in a very inappropriate way. So I do think that their normal boundary, that there weren't normal boundaries. And then of course there was this just not really being there.
Right. Right. Wow. And also, like, what allowed it to go on for so long? Meaning, what? I
think if the fire hadn't happened, it's an interesting thing, because the fire is such a miracle story. I was home alone. I could have died. I was really definitely saved by Hashem in that fire.
Wow.
I'll tell you that story.
In many ways.
In many ways. My husband always says that the biggest miracle is not my physically being saved, but that my neshama was really saved by that fire happening, because it ended something that I didn't have the inner strength to end until this kind of separation happened, this pause that gave me the strength to say, I'm not going to fall for his puppy dog eyes. I'm not going to look at him with empathy. I'm going to say no. I'm just going to say no.
Right.
And it wasn't like he didn't try again after that. He tried many times, and each time I said no. Right. And each time I received a punch in the stomach or a slap in the face or whatever it was, and called names.
And this is your own brother. So it's like, it's hard because you want to have a relationship, you want to feel close. And at the same time, you know that what he's doing is so. On
one hand, I felt empathy for him. On the other hand, I was quite disgusted by him.
I'm sure.
And felt, for lack of a better term, grossed out by his presence, by who he was, by the things he did. There was something so outside of normal society about him, and so many levels. I don't know that I ever really wanted to have a real relationship with him. I don't know what came first, my feeling sorry for him or my being abused. Like I never know. Did I feel empathy first? Did I?
Right, like which was the first, the chicken or the egg? Right. Wow. Looking back, are there things that you feel that maybe you could have done differently that would have maybe changed the situation?
It's a really interesting question, because for many, many years, I always thought, I wish I could go back in time. I would have stopped it. When I was 6, I would have stopped it. When I was 4, I would have stopped it. I would have never let it happen. I would have been like, no, because, it probably my saying no, it wasn't like he ever forced it on me. Once I said no, he would hit me or hurt me, but he didn't ever force it on me.
Right.
So there was that aspect of me. But once I was much older, I realized that every challenge that Hashem puts in our path is part of what makes us who we are. I think my very protective feelings for children, my empathy for children, my ability to really read their faces and read their body language comes from the experiences that I had, as painful as they were.
Sure.
So at this point in my life, do I feel I would go back, if I had the opportunity to go back in history and do it over? Would I? I wouldn't. I think that the struggles Hashem gives each neshama is planned for the growth of that neshama. And needed for whatever reason. It sounds terrible. A child's abuse should ever be needed for a neshama, but somehow it certainly made me a more empathetic, caring human being.
Wow.
And And whatever challenges you go through, you can always choose your path. Obviously, we always have a path in front of us. You can choose to emulate the person who abused you and continue abusing. You can choose to do the opposite. It's like children of alcoholics. Either become an alcoholic or never touch alcohol. So at this point in my life, I'd have to say I wouldn't change my childhood. I wouldn't change the experiences that I had or, the way that it happened.
Wow.
I don't know who I would be if I hadn't experienced what I experienced.
Wow.
Who knows what person I would have been.
Wow. And so it says so much about you that that's how you're taking it. Meaning it says like the fact that you're looking at and saying, this made me the person, the compassionate person that I am, like that's incredible, as opposed to you could look back and you could look at and say, Hashem, I'm angry at you for allowing this to happen to me. But you're saying, and this built me into a person that, in a way it allowed me to have certain strengths that otherwise I wouldn't have had.
It's interesting. I never felt angry at Hashem, but
this episode is all about setting up a healthy home. When you set up your own home, were there certain things that you put into place to make sure that this type of thing would, obviously never happen? And, what were the way that you raised your own children? How'd you go about that?
So a big part of what I did was I was a much more present parent. For years while my children were little, I taught only in Hebrew schools, Talmud Torahs, and that's how I got to kind of stay in teaching. But I was home, and if I wasn't home, my husband was home. So if I was, he was teaching during the day, and then he'd come home and I'd run out and go to do Hebrew school. The only reason I did Hebrew school is I needed an intellectual break from being around a lot of little children all day. If I just stayed home with children all day, I probably would have gone insane. So I needed a break. I did volunteer work sometimes so that I take children with me. I didn't like closed doors. I think a lot of victims of.
Thank you so much for sharing. It's giving us a window into this really challenging time and being so vulnerable with us about it. And I can't even begin to fathom what you went through, and I really appreciate you sharing with us.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you.
For this last segment of this episode, we are fortunate to be joined by a power couple, Dr. Akiva and Dr. Tamar Perlman. Dr. Akiva Perlman is an international speaker on topics of abuse, addiction, trauma. He has educated several hundred from social workers in our community, in the Orthodox community, and is currently serving as professor at Wurzweiler, as well as the clinical director of ODA's Wellness Institute, a clinic which serves the Hasidic community in Williamsburg. And Dr. Tamar Perlman is a licensed clinical psychologist who lectures on so many different topics, including parenting, marriage, emotion regulation, self-actualization, and has so many different workshops that she does. And she really helps out so many women and couples. And a really major thank you to both of you for joining us tonight.
It's a great honor. Thank you for having us.
Yes.
So Dr. Perlman, I guess I'll say Dr. Akiva Perlman. I know that you have spent the last 20 years working with many, many survivors. What, just tell us a little bit about what that work has been like. What does it do to the essence of a person when they've gone through something as traumatic as that?
Yeah. Some of the dearest people to me. I think when you have an opportunity to, where people welcome you into that very special space that's private and often filled with a great deal of pain. It's a great honor. And I think anytime I have an opportunity to share their story, because I think one thing we know about abuse in general is it tends to happen in darkness. It happens in secrecy. And the healing is when it's revealed. The healing is when we have moments like this, where we come together as a community and say, we need to talk about something, even though it's challenging to speak about out loud. And I think it's healing to the people who are living in that state of silence. This was a little while ago. This is actually right before that really terrible story we had with Walder. But there was a young couple that I was meeting with, and the young woman, she was a victim of abuse for many, many years from a family member. And she finally had built up the courage over a long period of time to say, let me speak to my family about it. And then we had this situation that happened with Walder, and there are many parts. I think in the long run, as a community, we responded very well. But the immediate after effect of it was complicated, like many immediate moments after a trauma. We're trying to collect ourselves. But I think in the long run, as a community, we stepped up. We really dealt with it the right way. But she saw the response. And she was like one step away from reaching out to her family members and saying, okay, this is my story. It took her years to build that courage. And then the moment she saw that response, she said, how am I supposed to talk? How am I going to be received by people? And it literally set her back several months.
Why is that?
Because she saw that certain people, like the conversation at the time, if we remember, became about Lashon Hara, Motzi Shem Ra, things like that. It moved away from the actual story, which I think is what we do. I think when there's something in front of us that's really hard to look at, we do our best to shield ourselves from that experience. So I think collectively, that's what we do. When there's another way to avoid addressing something head on, we'll find our way to do that. So I think that because it's so dark, because it's something that there's so much pain connected to it, we're doing our best to just protect ourselves, shield ourselves from that reality. So this type of work, you need to be able to face that all the time. There's like a natural desire to move away from it, and we need to find a way to jump into the fire over and over again, because that's what's required for the people who are suffering. They need us to do things like that. And I so deeply appreciate what you're doing for them, just by being here and saying, we're going to talk about it. We're going to give you a voice, even though they're nameless and we're not talking about them specifically. But just know it's like heartwarming for them to know that people are sharing their stories. So I know you asked the question of like, what happens to these people? What is their inner story? And I think for those who haven't really visited this story intimately, or very closely, they see it as, and you hear these comments all the time. I'm sure you hear them too. Like, well, what's the big deal? Something happened to a person, and many things happen to us. You know, we get into accidents, God forbid. We scrape our knee, we hit our head sometimes really hard, and then we bounce back up and we move on with our lives. So people kind of look at it through that particular lens, and they say, well, what's the big deal? Like, yeah, you went through something that was tragic, that was really hard, and we understand it was hard. But why can't you seemingly recover from such an experience? And I think it's something that my wife is going to speak about shortly, that we need to know that recovery is very possible and likely, so long as we're working it. But I think that just to give a little different perspective on this, that there's the difference between going through an experience and then being able to reflect on it and say, I went through something, and I could talk about what happened, and I could look back at it and reflect on how it impacted me in my life. And then there are experiences that alter your perception. They change the way you experience yourself, especially within the context of the world around you. And when we're talking about sexual abuse, we're talking about a transformative experience. And we could get into why, but I don't think we have enough time. But when you talk about abuse, when you talk about something that is in darkness, that is so private, that is so intimate, as an experience for someone to have, and so violating, that it's no longer just an experience, but rather it becomes them. And like we know, I think the difference between shame is when you internalize an experience, as opposed to going through a bad or troubling moment, where again, all you say is, I went through something hard and I survived. But shame is when it becomes a part of the person.
There are these people who, like you're saying, like it as they experience it, it changes their whole essence. They become a totally different person. So especially, I feel like in a way that's especially true when it's something, and I think the statistics, as we mentioned in the beginning of this episode, are more likely when it's someone within the home, not that stranger danger concept as anymore. So like that shame that one experiences and how much it changes a person is probably so much more true when it's, your own sibling, your brother, your sister, your aunt, your grandparent, because you can't escape it in a way. You can't get out of your home. Like these are your relatives, and you can't be at a family event, at a family simcha without like reliving it every single time. And it's a crazy thing.
Yeah. It's a lot easier to say, oh, there's a crazy person out there that I can't identify who harmed me. So you could say, oh, there's a nut out there. There's someone sick out there. But you can't say that when it's with your own people, when it's with your own community, at times when it's with your own family. Like you can no longer make those statements. And that makes it much more sinister.
Also, like what you were saying, like we have to do a better job of flashing the light and being able to see those people. But if it's happening within the home, that means that there's already some sort of break that's happening within the home that therefore people are not seeing that. Right. And it's like, we can try to shine a light, but clearly there's already some darkness that's already happening here that we're totally just missing.
Yeah, absolutely. Well
so
said.
maybe this will be a good segue to talk about how the two of you have set up your homes. I mean, to be a safe home, both of you being in this field of, of mental health and really, I can just tell by the way that you're talking, take a really serious approach towards this. What have you done in your own home to set up a safe home?
As you're speaking, I'm thinking, like you're speaking about the honor that we have in working with individuals that are survivors of sexual abuse. And I think that gives us a sense of the seriousness, and it gives us a sense of the sacredness of what we're talking about. But you certainly don't have to be two therapists in order to create safety in your home. I think what has been one of the most teachable, one of the most important things that I've been taught by the survivors, that at the end of the day, who they wish is there with them in the healing journey is their parents, not their therapists. And sometimes when I have these incredibly sacred healing moments with my clients, I have this feeling of guilt that I wish it was their mother that was sitting there or their father that was sitting in front of them that got to experience this moment of healing and of movement, of transcendence, of growth. Because ultimately who they really want to be their support and their safety is their parents. So in that context, there's so much to talk about when it comes to parenting and creating safety, but I want to focus on two ideas that are specific to this matter. And they're two kind of opposing ideas, but they both matter when it comes to parenting, when it comes to this. There was one client that taught me something so important that came from a very subtle story of abuse. I think some people wouldn't even call it abuse. Maybe it was sexual neglect, which I would put maybe, I'm not going to make a clinical statement about the level of importance I'm going to put in sexual abuse in relation to sexual neglect, but they're both quite serious. But I remember her talking about how she had a family member that would make her feel uncomfortable, but she just didn't know why she was uncomfortable. And this family member didn't end up doing actions that we would consider as explicit abuse. But she told me the moments that she went from feeling uncomfortable to questioning that she should probably not feel uncomfortable because it was somebody that was a trustworthy person. And then somebody that was telling her, no, it's okay that, for instance, I'm tickling you, or it's okay that I'm walking in while you're changing. You're silly for thinking this is not okay. And then it went to her questioning her own experience. Like, oh, it must be that I don't know how to read and read my own experience and know that this is okay and this is not okay. And it must be that whatever I feel is not relevant to what's happening. So this is the angle of what not to do. Meaning, because she wasn't given respect in her own experience, she didn't learn to trust it. So her own voice, which is the only voice you sometimes have when you're faced with a perpetrator, was not even accessible to her years down the line when she was actually abused. Because not that the abuse was ever because she didn't have voice. The abuse was there because the perpetrator abused her. But at that point already, she had questioned her own voice. This is uncomfortable, but I can't trust my own discomfort because I've been taught to not trust it in my childhood.
Is that when she was taught not to trust it, that was by a perpetrator also, meaning not by a parent or the way she was being raised?
Well, this was actually a parent. The person that didn't trust it, that didn't teach her how to trust it. So this is what not to do. So from this angle, we can talk about what yes to do. that respecting your children's experiences and giving them a sense that whatever it is that they feel has validity, taking your time to listen to them, taking their experiences seriously, even if it's bothersome or confusing to you, but at least pausing and saying, wait, why is it that you want it this way? Okay, do you prefer it this way? You prefer that you already want me to close the door? And saying that however it is that you feel regarding your body, regarding your belongings, regarding your space, I am taking that into account. I am valuing what you have to say because your experience has value. What you feel has value. That is a good way to tell whether or not something's okay for you. So that's the notion of respecting our children's experiences, giving them voice, taking them seriously, and honoring them, even if it's confusing for us or even if it's inconvenient for us sometimes. I think is one of the most important ways to model and communicate respect of boundaries, respect of space, respect of body. So that's one piece that I think cannot be taken lightly. And all of these positive ways of communicating the opposite of abuse, which is sacredness, which is choice, which is voice. We have moments like this throughout the week. They're opportunities. The second piece that I want to talk about is a feeling of when I've sat across the room from someone that was sharing a story of being victimized. Obviously, their loved one wasn't in the room with them. But the feeling of if my father came into the room, what would he do? Or if my mother came into this room, what would she do to the perpetrator? The feeling of security that they could imagine was part of their healing process. And this feeling of security came from a sense of there is nothing my parents wouldn't do to protect me. There is nothing, no line they wouldn't cross, nothing they wouldn't do, even if they didn't get to do it for them in the moment. But I know that their healing journey is going to be smoother and faster if I can bring in the safe parent that's protecting them into the room in an imaginary way, in a way that they could believe, in a way that makes sense to them. So if they can have this feeling of, oh, what would my father do? He would, and then I have had hours of fantasy of what the father would do to the perpetrator when he walked into the room. And that was hours and hours of healing for the client. So this feeling of security and attachment and they would do anything for me. All of that is built. That's usually in the earlier years of presence, of time, of attention, of communication, of safety, all of these words that we know, of emotional presence. And I want to make 2 points about that. I want to make a point about communication and I want to make a point about presence. So part of the safety and creating the safety for our children is communicating what safety is. I remember actually one of the conversations that we had with one of our kids. I remember it was such a sad moment. It was such a powerful moment. I remember it was during bath time and it was an opportunity. I don't do this every bath time with a young child, but it was a child young enough to still need help to bathe. And I said something like, remember that, I'm your mommy and this is your body and nobody can touch your body without permission. And then I remember him asking, but mommy, what if it's a nice person? A nice person wouldn't hurt me. And it was a moment where I realized that I'm really teaching my child that the world isn't innocent. And I'm teaching my child that the world has parts of it that are not safe. And that's sad.
Yeah. Wow.
And I encountered my own anxiety in that moment of, this isn't just words. I am raising a child in a world that isn't fully safe. I am telling you, my child, that there are people out there that appear to be nice, but aren't. What a terrible message to give.
Yeah. It's hard. It's a very hard thing to talk about as a parent. Someone actually said to me that they take major issue with the song. You know, the song Noach was a big tzaddik?
Yes.
So you know how it says every yid is a big tzaddik?
Interesting.
So someone said that's it's a message that at this point we can't give over to our generation anymore. You can debate with that, whether you want to take that issue or not with the song, but it's an interesting thing, you know, like that's a message that in a way we give over to our children. Every yid's a big tzaddik. And someone said to me, how can we say that? Not every single yid, they might appear like a big tzaddik, but is it true? Is every single Jew really such a big tzaddik? It's interesting. They raised it to me in the context of, you know, I was telling them that we're doing this project on Child Safety Month. And it's just interesting, which, you know, as you're saying that it's a sad thing to have to give that over to a child, to like ruin that innocence, because a child is in that state of innocence.
You know, it's interesting because as you're saying this, I'm thinking about the second point I wanted to make. I think that if you could make that statement if you also make the other one. I think that a lot of times we need to give our children messages that are contradictory, but they're both real. So I think that if we communicate that there is holiness in every Jew, but you can also communicate that there is brokenness and then there is darkness and that people make huge mistakes. I think then they can hold both, because this is a complex world. And this is, I think that children are able to, over the years, hear the complexity, even though at the beginning they need a bit more of the black and white. But as they grow up, they hear the complexity. And that's part of what I wanted to say, that in talking to children about safety, I think this is extremely important to both children and parents. A lot of times children don't say anything to their parents because if they encounter something uncomfortable or the beginning of what could be this kind of process where a child is being cordoned into the process of being abused, a lot of times the first step, 1 to 3 steps, if it's caught in the first 3 steps, then the steps 4 to 5, which is where the abuse happens, let's say, could be avoided. But why won't a child share something in step 1, 2, and 3? So there's a few reasons why. One of them, and I think maybe you could speak to this, if they don't feel like they have a relationship enough with the parent to be able to share it. So that's in the related to the relationship between the parent and child. But another reason is if they feel like they did something wrong that contributed to the abuse happening.
That's the shame that you were mentioning before.
Yes,
right?
But that the shame that's there, even before the abuse happens, like let's say the part of them that wanted to talk to the perpetrator because they liked the attention. This is even before. So they feel like, oh, I've already did something wrong. And mommy told me already not to talk to this person or to strangers. So I don't want to say that I did something wrong. And I was actually thinking, Kivi, as you were speaking, because about how the perpetrators see the emptiness in the eyes. I understood that, and it made me almost like protective of them even more. But it made me think maybe they also see a certain special light in their eyes or special desire for connection, or because these are of the holiest people I know. And they interpret it as emptiness because they see it as how it's going to suit them, because that's their perspective. But really what they see is this depth, this light, this ability and desire to connect in a very sacred way. A sensitivity. And they use it, they abuse it literally for their own benefit.
Right.
And I think to communicate that even if you make a mistake, you don't have to be perfect in it. Even if you, that is a very important point, because it gives permission to the child to say, oh, even if I make a mistake in this, I don't have to be perfect in this. I still, first of all, deserve to not be mistreated. But second of all, I can still share it with my parent and I won't be blamed. I won't be told that this was my fault, which is obviously the worst thing to do. And it's the biggest indicator of someone not having a harder time in healing if the first response is blame and shaming. And
the amount of research on that is through the roof. The first responder being indicative of so much of what the story is going to look like throughout that person's life. Because again, like Tamar is saying, like they're already carrying so much. They're already carrying all these like very mixed feelings often. It's not only bad, which I think often people think. Like there's also a feeling of I did something bad, I contributed, or this person is good, I need to protect them.
Yes. Whatever
that might be. So just understanding in that, like that complexity, bringing that into the story as well.
There's a lot of confusion around it. When we look at abuse in the past sense, to us it is wrong, and we know what is wrong and we know what is right. But when a victim is in the middle of being abused or pre-abuse, confusion is always there. It's not such a known thing that it's confusing, but it is extremely confusing. And even afterwards, it could be confusing, but in the moment, it's for sure very confusing. But I also wanted to speak to, we're giving permission to the children to not be perfect, right? But I also want to give voice to, there is this anxiety around parents needing to do this perfectly also. The perfect conversation, saying the perfect thing, not saying the wrong thing, not saying too much, not saying too little. We need to take this extremely seriously because it is extremely serious. But I think the anxiety, and a lot of times why parents don't talk about this topic altogether, is this fear and this need for perfection. I feel like you can talk about this better.
It's also such an interesting point, like what you're saying, because I've been doing a lot of conversations in this topic, and what you just said, it really struck me that the way your first response to the child when they tell you is so, I don't want to put too much weight on it, like you're saying, because they don't have to be perfect. But at the same time, there's something very important about it. Your first reaction to them to kind of, in a way, just be normal about it, and not to go alarmist about it. Because that's what's going to scare off the children, and that's going to want them to make them think either A, maybe I did something wrong, or maybe I shouldn't really be telling you about this, or like what did I just do? So like you're saying, it's that first response is again, like I hear what you're saying, not to put too much pressure for the parents to have to feel this perfectionist, like, needing to be perfect in that scenario, but at the same time to just be able to, whenever a child comes to tell us anything, really, in certain ways, we should just be as, more or less like mellow and, take it normally as possible.
Mellow, supportive, encouraging, thanking them for sharing that with you, making the focus about them. Yes. And I think what ends up often happening, because like you're mentioning, that there's so much anxiety around this whole subject matter, most parents immediately get to that place of, well, what did I do wrong? And that kind of derails the whole process. The process in the moment is directly focused on the child, saying, thank you for sharing this with me. And it took so much courage, and you did the right thing, and you're so beautiful, and you're exactly the way you're supposed to be. And you did nothing wrong, which I think is a very important message. There's certain lines as a therapist or as a person, like you're hoping never to hear from a client. And I think when there's certain lines, like they say in this particular area, where when they sort of see themselves as being the center of the problem, which is the difference between like 6 months of therapy versus potentially 6 years of therapy, where once it crosses over, and I think the first responder has a tremendous opportunity to sort of, regulate that idea and say, you're exactly the way you're supposed to be. Something happened to you, as opposed to you contributed to something that or you were a part of something. And I think that idea, especially hearing it from a calm, collected parent who's the most loving person in that child's life, is like a great way to set them off on this journey with a lot of success. And there is a lot of success. We need to know that there's a lot of pain. And we often talk about it. I think people look at it like, this is the end. But just know there's a lot of success. Some of the best people I know in the world have some of this in their past, in their history, where they've needed to work through it. But it was that work that just allowed them to become, even more beautiful than they already were.
It's true.
Right. Wow. Would you say that besides for the communication that we've already been talking a lot about, would you say that there are certain guidelines or, ways that you set up your specific home to make sure that, nothing like this ever becomes even for a second into your home?
I think like Tamar was saying, there's no perfection in this. And I think we need to sort of lose that idea. We have guidelines. We have certain ideas that are really important. We want to normalize the body to a person. We want to explain to them what they're going through. We want to give them some pretty clear rules as to what is acceptable and what is unacceptable in terms of anyone touching different parts of their bodies, creating room enough and space within that relationship that if there is a question or a concern or a thought, again, without the anxiety, that they feel like they could come to that parent and share that. But again, every parent is different, and also every child is different. Right. So you want to work with certain guidelines of there are important ideas to make their way to this child, which I'm sure you've been speaking about. But we need to be somewhat flexible and imperfect in it. I don't think there's a way to perfectly inoculate a child from ever feeling any distress in their life or discomfort. Well, as adults, we kind of know that. It's an interesting thing that, like, we want to raise our kids in perfection when we kind of look back and say that doesn't really happen very often.
Right.
But we still place that burden upon ourselves.
Yeah, that's very true.
So we have the guidelines and we stick with those guidelines, but just know there are certain children that are very curious and they'd like to hear more about it. And others who are like, Dad, come on, man. Like, this is the second time we're having this. I know. So you're going to have to revise for every single child, something a little bit different. But at the end of the day, you want them to feel that, number one, they know what's white, which means acceptable, and what is not acceptable. You want to feel confident that my child knows that one way or another. And they also know that there's a parent in this house that is here and willing to listen,
yes,
and not afraid of such a subject matter. When you look at the research, it's interesting that most of these conversations are had between mothers and their children. Last I checked, it's only around 1/3 of parents have this conversation with their parents and with their children. And of that 1/3 of that group, 2/3 of the time it's the mother, not the father. So we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah. Why do you think that is?
I think men are very uncomfortable with these things. They don't have their own sense of comfort with this language. And as a result of that, like, we just find a way to push it off further down the road. And then there's a certain line where we cross it, where we say, they're too old to start the conversation now. I think that's why when you start in a very normal, collected way, the same way you discuss anything else, you just make it a part of the dialogue. Then it's not shocking. It's not terrifying for anybody, certainly a parent, let alone a child, where it's just a part of, like you're saying, a part of giving a bath to a child, identifying different parts and allowing them to know that about themselves. And then when they get a little bit older, a little bit more complex in terms of that conversation.
I actually think that, like, I wonder what you think about this as to why I think men are a bit more uncomfortable with it. Fathers.
I'm probably going to agree.
Fathers, I think from the privilege that I've had in inviting fathers into the room of when I've worked with victims, there's lessons that I learned in this many, at the beginning especially, but now I'm more informed. I think the fathers, we were talking about earlier of what comes up for us when a child says something, right? Our own anxieties can come up. And how do we stay kind of even when we feel activated, when we feel emotionally overwhelmed? I think a father's sense of protectiveness of his children and the shame that can come up for him, like, this will not come near my child, especially for a daughter. That sense of protectiveness and the shame, if it does, it's for a father to face that is so raw and so brutal that it takes a lot of selfhood and a lot of ability to kind of face your darkest places. I've sometimes had fathers that were in the room with us, where I felt like I prepared the victim in talking to the father and her need. But when I didn't prepare the father,
Mm-hmm.
The shame of, I wasn't there to protect you.
Right.
I wasn't, the nightmare occurring. And even though he was not the perpetrator or far from it, meaning he did whatever he could, but he didn't ultimately protect his child. The shame was so large that even in that moment afterwards, sometimes they were not able to give the oomph of what the child was asking for.
Right.
Because they had to face, well, this was her fantasy of, I need you to show up for me now. This was their nightmare that they hadn't worked through. So I think part of what we're talking about with the earlier points that I made with respecting our children, which it means like seeing them as separate from us, seeing their needs as separate from us, recognizing that their experiences are different from ours sometimes, and we need to listen to them to hear what their needs are, also means that we are somewhat separate from them, being able to have a self that is able to have a relationship with emotions and not ask our children to take care of us. I think that's one of the most important pieces of a healthy home, is where we are there for our children and not have our children be there for us emotionally. Because then if our children are there for us emotionally, then how are they going to turn to us if they need us to be there for them? I've had countless of teenagers tell me, when I've had this feeling of like, so why don't you tell your mom? Or why don't you tell your dad? And like the painful line of, even as the sentence will start coming out, my mom will get so nervous that I'll have to start to take care of her. Or my dad will get so mad that I'll just be too embarrassed. So I think like this is like my lifelong journey, is learning to be a strong adult myself, be a grounded adult, be a self that has enough to give, to be able to put my ego, to put my anxieties, to put my fears aside, to be able to be a better giver to my child. And this is hard. This is hard because we get tested, and we get challenged in ways that are really on the spaces that are most difficult for us often. But this lifelong work on, what does my child need from me, and what does this mean that I need to shed or work on or put aside? I think that avoda, that work, creates for a more healthy space.
Amen.
Yeah. Parenting is like the biggest mussar seder, because it really shows us where we need to work on. And like you're saying right now, it's such a powerful idea that really to strengthen ourselves, that way we can be independent, not needing, any validation in any way from our children. It's really so true. So true. Wow. Very, very powerful message. Thank you both so much. I feel like we can talk for hours about this topic, and we'll have to continue the conversation another time about parenting in general. Thank you really to both of you for taking the time to speak, and you have so much experience and so much wisdom on this, and it's really so incredibly helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
It was a real honor.
Yes, really. It's a real honor. And I just
really is close for me.
I just wanted to end with one piece that you were saying regarding healing, because I feel like it's an important piece to add. I think, like you were saying, that healing is there, and speaking about the empty eyes or the sparkly eyes, that like when I look back and think about the victims that I've worked with, like in my mind's eye, I stand up to them. I stand up to them. I think, like you were saying, Kivi, they are of the most powerful individuals that I know. And I think that they had to face darkness within themselves and in the world. They had to almost like face like the deepest animal part of them and humanity. But then they got to bring godliness into that space. And it's like a sort of Tchias HaMesim. And I think that they are godlier people. They really are. And this isn't to quiet the anxiety around protecting our kids, because that is something that we should be anxious about it, to the extent that we protect them to the best way that we can, or create safety the best way that we can. But I want to echo what you were saying, that I want to take the shaking of the teeth out of the conversation, because we need to ground ourselves in the reality. At the end of the day, not only can we not fully protect our kids, because ultimately they're in Hashem's hands, but then even in the darkness, there is healing. And I have seen Hashem do the healing in these spaces. And the individuals are of the most remarkable individuals that have brought light into the most dark places. So I just wanted to.
It's like the Gemara Brachos says that, the place where Balei Tshuva stand, that even Tzaddik and Gemurim don't stand there, because they've went through things, like you're saying, that the darkness that they've experienced and the fact that they were able to overcome that darkness makes them into such more incredible people. Wow. Very powerful.
Yes, they really are.
Wow.
Some of the best. Some of the best.
I think so.
My clients often say thank you. And I say, it's going in the other direction. You know what it's like to be close to a person who's needed to visit places I wouldn't even know.
Yeah.
And look at who you are as a human being. Like, thank you for allowing me to be in your presence.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Incredible. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you both. Really. Thank you so much again.
Thank you.
Great honor. All the best.
Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of the Jews Next Door. I hope you enjoyed as much as I did. I'd love to hear your takeaways. Reach out to us. Reach out to me at yair@jenaleph.org, hi@jenaleph.org. You can check us out on the website. You could leave a question there. We'd love to be in touch. Please be in touch. Check us out on Instagram at Parenting the Jews Next Door. Hit me up on Twitter at yair_menshel. And we're on TikTok now too. We have some great content, a lot of really great insights into parenting, tips, parenting pointers, reaction videos, and quotes. We have a lot going on. We have a lot of articles. You want to check it out. Check it out at jenaleph.org. You won't be sorry you did. And I look forward to hearing from you. And if you haven't yet subscribed to the podcast, make sure you subscribe and share it with your family and friends. Looking forward to another great episode next week.